Welcome to sunny Copenhagen. My name is Jesper Nytoft Bergman, and I'm the Director and Executive Dean here at AVT Business School. And I'll be your host for the next 30 minutes. After a short introduction, our main speaker, Andy Wicks, will talk about the purpose of a corporation in this webinar. If you think back to the last major crisis, namely the financial crisis, the argument was that greedy and unethical business leaders led to the financial crisis. It seemed like business leaders only had their self-interest and focus solely on shareholder value. A lot of things has changed since the financial crisis. The climate change agenda has had major impact on elections around the world, and corporations have had to take a hard look at themselves at how their own ambitions to fighting the climate change. Also, inequality as another major theme has had a great impact on management decisions lately. The Business Roundtable in the US, which represents around 200 of the biggest corporations in the US, made a statement about the purpose of a corporation in August 19. The statement takes a stakeholder view of the purpose of a corporation, and we'll surely get back to that. You see, business and ethics are not a contradiction. On the contrary, as business women and men live to service people's needs. However, it seems like we sometimes forget that. Let me give you an example. In a social event, we often ask each other questions about how well the business is doing. And if you are like me, we often talk about profits or loss, but not so much how we're doing towards our organizational purpose. Andy and many others have argued and urged us to think about this differently. And we'll discuss this with Andy. Andy Wicks is Professor of Business Administration at the Darden School of Business with a special expertise with an integration of ethics across academic disciplines. Andy is internationally known for his research in business ethics and stakeholder theory. And Andy will also examine topics like trust and healthcare ethics. At AVT Business School, Andy teaches our purpose-driven leadership course on the Executive CBA and MBA program. And you can find more information about that on our website. So welcome to you, Andy, and thank you for joining us in this discussion about the purpose of a corporation.
Thank you, and thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you to all of you for taking some time out of what sounds like a beautiful Friday afternoon in Copenhagen to be with us. I am here in Charlottesville, where it is a lovely day. And I was also just mentioning to Jesper, I'm ruining the fact that I just found out that our executive MBA program is not coming to Europe this summer as I'd originally hoped. We've been coming now for the last 8 years. And because of COVID-19, we won't be coming this year. So I am very sad about that. But a little bit more about me. I'm actually a religious studies PhD. I got inspired to go to grad school because I wanted to ask big questions, but I wanted to ask them with my feet squarely on the ground. I wanted to think about how ideas mattered in the world. That led me to a program in religious studies at UV that focused on medical ethics, and that was really how I was trained. But while I was there, I met a guy at the Darden School named Ed Freeman, and it just so happened that Ed Freeman was the founder of stakeholder theory. And just a couple years before I met him, he had published what turned out to be a classic and iconic book called Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach. And it's pretty universally hailed as the first coherent, systematic articulation of a stakeholder view, although he mentions in the book the threads of that idea came from a lot of different ideas, a lot of different other thinkers who also deserve credit for capturing this idea. So I was extremely fortunate that right in my backyard, there was this guy who was an incredible teacher and a brilliant thinker who came up with this idea. That work inspired me to go on Work with Ed, have him on my dissertation committee, and then get a job in business schools. I've been teaching business ethics now for 28 years, which is pretty hard to believe. But a lot of it's been on this topic, and I look forward to engaging with you today and trying to make sense of, how do we think about the corporation? What are the stories that we tell ourselves and which our communities tell about business, and how does that influence the way in which corporations behave in the world? I think now more than ever, there's a huge amount at stake in how we operate in the world. Clearly, we need businesses to thrive, for us to prosper, for them to prosper, and the world to be better off. At the same time, if we're not asking hard questions about the impacts of what we do on other people, we're missing out on a huge part of what happens in the global business community. Dramatic effects for climate change, for the environment, and for community well-being. And so those are all questions at the core of what stakeholder theory tries to speak to. And my hope in the way we teach at Darden is highly interactive. So you're not going to see slides. I'm not going to stand up here and lecture, but I am happy to take questions, to interact with you and tell you more about stakeholder theory. And maybe with that, I'll kick it back to Jesper, and I think you maybe have some questions for me.
Absolutely. So again, just going back, I know the stakeholder theory is from the 74, I think. So it's quite a while back. But again, I think for many people, conventionally, creating that balance between value creation and the pursuit of purpose, seems to, in many minds, I think, also from maybe investors, etc., can conflict with profit maximization. So how do you see that?
Well, again, it is really interesting, because if I start, and again, I'd ask you to think about who's telling that story. Who is defining the purpose of the corporation? Well, if I go back to 1970 and Milton Friedman, it's an economist. And economists have a particular way of thinking about the world and telling a story about business. If you talk to a philosopher, they're going to give you a different way of speaking and thinking about that. If you talk to somebody who's in human psychology and really understands human beings, they're going to give you a very different account. So part of it is just to be mindful and aware of what is the story that I'm being told, who's telling it, and what are the biases that they bring. Well, if you talk to somebody in finance and economics, it's going to be all about the money. And nobody's disagreeing, and there's nothing in the stakeholder theory that says money and taking care of your shareholders is unimportant. Indeed, if you're not doing that, you don't get to survive. But that doesn't mean that just because it's something I have to do, that becomes the defining purpose. It's like saying, I'm a human being. If I don't produce blood cells, red blood cells, I'm going to die. Does that make the purpose of my life to make as many red blood cells as possible? It doesn't follow. So, you're rather than saying that's a purpose, you could argue that that's really a constraint, a boundary condition. I have to be able to do that, but I got to be able to think about what are the things I need to do, and to do them consistently and do them well over time in order to generate that profit. So you're really focusing on an outcome. It doesn't really tell me how. It just says, make as much money as I possibly can. And that really opens business up to some of the critiques that are out there. I don't know, have you ever seen the film, The Corporation? It's a documentary. It's about 15 years old, but it's absolutely brilliant and a devastating critique of business. On the cover of this is back when they still had DVDs. On the cover of the art of it shows a guy with a briefcase and a hat, like an executive going to work. But if you look carefully, you'll see coming out of the back of the guy, there's a tail with a triangle at the end of it and horns coming out of the guy's head. He is the devil. And the argument in the documentary is, if corporations truly are whatever I have to do to make as much money as I possibly can, that is the literal definition of a sociopath. Right? If all money is all that matters and I would do anything to make just a little bit more, then you are a sociopath. And that is why corporations are terrifying. And this is not just a fringe critique. If you go to popular culture, I'm guessing many of your viewers here have seen the Disney movie Monsters, Inc. It's a great kids movie. It came out about 10 or 15 years ago. Well, who is the bad guy in Monsters, Inc.? It's the corporate CEO trying to protect the family business. And he would do anything, including killing little kids, in order to protect his corporation. This is not just the story we're telling ourselves about business. This is the story we're teaching our children about business. And I think it's a deeply destructive story that we ought to spend some time saying, is that really what business is about? Because I think there's a lot of reasons to believe a different story is really what's driving how we interact with business, as well as what we expect of business.
Great. But again, if I'm a conventional manager and thinking that people are somewhat egocentric and hence thinking, you know, what's in it for me?
Right.
I'm 47 years old, and I've held that view for quite a while.
Yeah.
So how would you actually help me in changing my mindset? I mean, talking about it is one thing, but
right.
You know, how do you get me to change, or where do I start?
This is another huge piece of this. And again, I go back to who is telling us what is the nature of a human being. If I start with an economist and I start with a finance person, they're going to emphasize and underscore the selfish, individualistic nature of humans. And there's no question that that is part of our nature. But we know if we talk to our colleagues in psychology, if we talk to evolutionary biologists, if we look around in particular contexts, it really highlights ways in which we are actually very collaborative species. The reason why Homo sapiens survived and our nearest ancestors did not was because of our capacities to create what's called shared intentionality. If you go into a ward where newborns are cared for, if you introduce an animal or you introduce an adult and they cry, the newborn will ignore it. But if they hear another newborn cry, they will cry. It's not because they choose to, it is they're wired to do that. We have all kinds of very complex wiring that shows how much we are a collaborative species. So I think that message around individualism versus being attuned to groupishness gets overplayed by our finance colleagues. I think the other piece around this is, yes, we care about having more money and more stuff, but there's a lot of other things that we care a lot about. And some colleagues and I have written about this. One, we care a lot about fairness. So if I am treated fairly by somebody, particularly by a business, what's my reaction? If you talk to most people, if a company goes out of its way to look out for you, what do you want to do? Well, I want to go back and I want to work with that business. I want to reciprocate. I want to treat them well. I want to return my business with them, right? We feel that sense of connection and appreciation for an organization. What happens when we work with an organization that is so focused on its own interest that I feel like they took advantage of me, right? They stuck it to me. What do I do to that organization? I want to look for any opportunity I can to stick it back to them, even if it costs me something, right? I relish the opportunity to do that. And that again suggests that it's not necessarily a good strategy to go around and doing anything you can to make money, because if you do that, you're going to alienate some people that you really want their goodwill.
All right. Just turning to the business roundtable.
Yeah.
And for those of you who might not know what that was all about, and maybe missed the introduction, so around 200 organizations, the largest organizations in the US, signed this statement on the purpose of a corporation, where they kind of committed to delivering value to customers, investing in employees, dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers, supporting the community in which they work, and generating long-term value for shareholders, so not just short-term. And they also mentioned that each of their stakeholders is essential. So in your, of course, teaching for many years and working with Ed Freeman, so was this surprising that it came out in August 19, or how did you see that coming? Because these are some of the biggest corporations in the US, JP Morgan, etc., signing that statement.
I mean, the specific timing, I don't know what precipitated it. It's been a topic of conversation for some time. And I would also just alert your participants to a film that we just released. It's not widely available yet, but we're trying to get it on streaming services called Fishing with Dynamite. And it's a movie, it's a documentary all about how we think about the purpose of business. So it's sort of ironic that we're coming out with this film right around the time that the Business Roundtable has made this statement. I don't know what their specific motivations were, but I know that people are asking harder and different questions today about business and its impacts. Part of that is around climate change, because again, you know, if I'm doing my own little thing and I'm not affecting anybody else, well, we would largely say you can do what you want. But when you're doing things and they're impacting other people, especially when they're harming other people, all of a sudden now it's a very different thing. And especially with things like climate change, pollution, externalities, that's a real problem. And as a result, the collective starts to say, you have to change what you're doing. I think a stakeholder theory reminds people that business is a human institution created by people that's supposed to serve people. And if that's not happening, or if they're serving some people but not others, there's reason to go back and rethink how we're going about constructing and operating businesses. You know, it's fascinating to me. If you talk to people in finance, again, they want to talk more about the money. But if you talk to entrepreneurs, and many of the entrepreneurs who've made a huge impact in our country and helped generate some of the biggest, most influential businesses around, if you ask them why did they do what they did, it's not because they wanted to get filthy, stinking rich. It's they wanted to change the world. They believed that their product, their service, what they were doing was something that would make humanity better off. And to me, that's the piece around purpose. That's, you know, it's not this new thing that all of a sudden we're talking about. It's kind of always been there. If you ask yourself the question, you know, think of any business that you interact with. Why do you go there? Well, because they make products or services that make your life better. Otherwise, you would not give them your hard-earned money. You'd hold on to it. So it's really about understanding every business has a purpose. How do you think about that? How do you express it? What are the ways in which what you do make other people better off that you want to hold on to? Because if I care about the money, and again, every business has to, the question is not that, it's how. And if I start to turn to the how, then it becomes, what am I going to do that helps people want to do business with me? And that's usually around creating great products, treating people well, having a highly collaborative, competitive, and successful system in place within my organization, with my supply chain, with other groups that I depend on to create that great product or experience. And then I'm back to things that start to sound like what we talk about with respect to purpose.
Right. So in terms of, you know, about a firm purpose, would you, where would you actually go? You know, would you start at the starting point? Is that the stakeholder theory, or where would you start?
Well, again, I think that's a highly individual thing for firms. I think both stakeholder theory and shareholder theory give me broad templates of kind of what that ought to be about. But I think ultimately every organization needs to have a particular way of expressing it that is genuinely theirs. And again, it's not some abstract PR statement that I put out there to make people get a warm and fuzzy feeling. Again, I would go back and say, I could hire a sociologist today to walk into your firm, and we just walk around, and within a matter of a couple of days, we could write a report that tells you, here is the actual functional purpose that is embedded in how people operate in your organization, right? I can tell you that. The only interesting question is it the right one? Is it the one that you want? And is it the one that helps you be your best? Because if I understand organizational purpose right, again, I can't get away from it. Does it help me connect people to my organization? One of the things that any organization wants is to be sticky. They want people to want to work for you. They want people to want to come back and buy from you, not just once, but again and again and again. They want suppliers who want to supply us, right? So what do I need to do in articulating that purpose and then living it out that makes those groups want to come back, want to be a part of my organization? And also ought to help us focus on, we do this. If this is what we need to be really great at, then chances are there's other stuff that matters, but maybe it doesn't matter as much as this core thing that my purpose statement really helps me articulate. And it also hopefully allows us to be focused and strategic, right? While we want to inspire people and make them feel good, we can't do everything. So what are the things we don't do? Those are the kinds of things that a well-articulated purpose can be really helpful with.
So turning to the current crisis, so how do you think the COVID-19 has impacted the firm purpose And of course, you're coming from the US. We might not hear, certainly a lot of us are from Europe listening in. So,
Yeah.
so what are the conversations around that?
Well, I mean, again, this goes back to what we talk about character. You don't figure out a person's character when times are great. You really understand character when things get hard. And I think we're learning a lot about individual corporations and individual leaders. There's some things that have happened in the US where, people look at corporations and individual decision makers and say how callous they've been. Firms that have been laying off people left and right. Firms that have been applying for aid when they don't really need it. Harvard University applying for aid that was meant to go to distressed organizations when everybody knows Harvard has more money than just about anybody. But there've also been some remarkable stories where people in organizations have really gone the extra mile. And I just literally did a session with our graduating students last week. And I was originally going to do it on artificial intelligence and ethics on the frontier. But with COVID-19, at the last minute, I said, I've got to shift the conversation. And literally all we talked about was COVID-19. I was really inspired by some of the things that my own students are doing. There's a woman who works for an engineering firm, has nothing to do with healthcare. She had a colleague who was an infectious disease doctor. She had folks in her engineering firm, and they very quickly switched over and started creating with 3D printers PPE that's now supplying doctors and hospitals. And again, something that they just chose to do at their own expense. They had no idea what they were doing until they saw the need. And then that motivated them to try to do something really incredible. I think you're also seeing some firms, especially with advertising, trying to sound like they're very attuned to the moment. I think like everybody else, marketing messages are easy. What I want to see is the behavior. And what's that real thing that's there that shows me that that's genuine versus just what I want you to believe about me.
All right, I'm also watching the chat if my eyes goes a bit all over the place. So, but a question that's come in, so if we assume that purpose motivates in an organization, how does higher organizational purpose like climate change or the UN development goals motivate? Does that motivate more?
I think that's a good question. And again, even in organizations where you could argue they're doing more harm, I've done cases on ExxonMobil, which is a fossil fuel company, and many people would like to see them simply disappear. Even in organizations like that, I would argue that there aren't people in those organizations that wake up saying, today I really want to destroy the planet, right? That really makes me feel good. Part of why ExxonMobil exists is because people like you and me have cars and we put gasoline in them, and this is part of how our life works. So we have, if there is blame to be had, we share it as well as ExxonMobil. The question becomes, how can we harness that desire to have a healthier planet and to create a future where our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren have a future on this planet? And I think more and more people are saying, we've got to do a better job of really understanding what is the footprint of an organization. There is a huge growth in a demand for information about organizations. And my colleague and I just wrote an academic paper on this, talking about within stakeholder theory, there's been way too much focus just on the positives. If I'm a stakeholder firm, well, clearly, I just want to make the world better and I want to make my stakeholders better off. Well, the reality is, if I look at firms that you might even say are good, quote unquote, stakeholder firms, they still allocate harm. They still have destructive behaviors that are part of that overall, arguably positive benefit, but some things, places where they can get better. And there's lots of organizations that are capturing that information and trying to make sense of it. If you look at integrated reporting, things like what Unilever's doing, they're trying to help stakeholders better understand what is that footprint. And I think that's one of the big challenges of today in the next 10 years is, how do we help understand the full implications of what companies are doing? And how do we help them do a better job? Because if we don't get better, we're all in big trouble.
So just again, have you, apart from the Business Roundtable signing it, have you seen major progress uh, from where you're sitting? I mean, in terms of them actually trying to not just focus on shareholder value, but also stakeholders?
Well, again, I think if you look at a number of the organizations that score very highly with respect to key stakeholder groups, you're also seeing firms that do well financially. Best employers also tend to be organizations that do really, really well in terms of profitability. And so I think, and again, if you go back to that psychology that I talked about, if we are an interdependent set of groups that create something together, the more you can have that positive synergy, the better the outcomes are going to be. And to me, that just makes intuitive sense. If I see stakeholders' interests as conflicting and competing, and if I give $1 to you, Jesper, I can't give $1 to somebody else. So you and that other stakeholder become antagonistic because you both want the dollar. Well, the dollar is certainly important, but if we collaborate together, we can actually grow the pie. And so it's not really you get the dollar or he gets the dollar. It's if we collaborate and do more together and we do a better job of that, we can actually have $2 so each of you gets one. But the other thing that we miss is that organizations, part of why we work is we want more than just money and stuff. Again, I articulated fairness, but there's another idea which is around living out our values. I want to work in an organization that makes the world a better place. How do organizations not only articulate their values, but live them? And when they do, if we do something good for the world, like that colleague I just mentioned, that student in that engineering firm, it's not just she that feels good about what she does. Think about how her colleagues feel, right? Well, wow, somebody in my organization did this incredible thing. That becomes something that the whole organization can feel the benefit of. And if you think about the corporations, the companies that you do business with regularly, why do you go back? For a lot of those organizations, there is something more than just the product that you get. It's affiliation with a brand, an identity, a set of implied values that you resonate with. Corporations are smart, they understand that. And if you don't articulate that bigger something, you're leaving things on the table because that's something that people seek when they go out and they decide, who do I affiliate myself with?
Right. So, and if you, so if I'm one of the participants listening to you here and I feel very passionate about, yes, we should do more, maybe first of all, focused work on our own purpose, but how to actually sell it into the rest of the management team? Do you have any tips or tricks for that?
Well, again, to me, it's less about selling it and really understanding the differences in what these two stories are trying to get at. The story about money and focusing on, we have to be competitive, and if we can't take care of our shareholders, we don't survive. Absolutely, that's not an incorrect or a wrong message, but it doesn't tell me the how. And to me, if I'm interested in the how, and I'm interested in doing it consistently over time, then I think you get drawn into the kinds of conversations that stakeholder theory leads me to talk about. One of the areas that I do a good bit of writing in, you mentioned this in the introduction, is on trust. And I think trust is a great example of thinking about this. Jesper, if I think that you are self-interested, and the assumption in the literature is self-interest with guile, which means, Jesper, if you get the chance and when I turn my back, not just that you want to take stuff from me, but you're willing to stab me in the back. If I assume that about you and you assume that about me, why would I ever trust you? The reality is if I make that assumption about markets and people in markets, then trust becomes, I'd love to have it, but it is irrational. As a matter of fact, if I start trusting people, I'm a sucker because as soon as I trust them and I turn my back, they're going to stab me in the back. Well, that's a huge cost because if I can't trust you, how do I protect myself? Well, I got to hire a lot of lawyers. I got to write a lot of very elaborate and expensive contracts. And we have to start finding ways to sort of point guns at each other so we know you're going to cooperate. That's expensive. That also really reinforces distrust across us. If instead I recognize, Jesper, you're a good guy. I know Jesper. I know he wouldn't turn his back on us. What's the benefit of that? Well, if we can create a relatively trusting relationship, if we're interdependent, instead of worrying about how if I share information that's important that I know you want, worrying about if I do that, how you're going to take advantage of me, I can start to freely share that information. You become more effective, and in turn, you're going to start sharing more information with me. Well, if knowledge and responding to changes in the world matter in how we create new value, all of a sudden we just have an incredibly valuable resource that we can share that in a different context where we don't have trust doesn't exist. And if the world is changing rapidly, which it is, again, if we can create relatively trusting relationships, we can adapt in real time without having to call the lawyers and constantly updating the contracts. So there's incredible economic value that I can show you if I talk to my economist friends that say, if you can do this, that has huge value. Well, the stakeholder theory says if we just throw out this outmoded and I think overly simplistic view of human nature, then things like trust in organizations actually start to make sense.
All right. We can't make all the questions today because time is running out. But one last one, Andy. So are you optimistic for the future of stakeholder theory and of course organizations and the broader sense, I guess, right from the movies, as you mentioned about Disney, about how they portray corporations. Are you optimistic about the future?
I am. And again, I think our film Fishing with Dynamite really starts to speak to this, because I think especially if you look at young people, millennials, they have this really strongly expressed desire to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And I also think that what we're facing with history, what is happening in this particular moment, is pushing us to reckon with some huge questions where if we don't start to come and stand together and agree to make changes that make everyone better off, we're in deep, deep trouble. So while I'm not Pollyannish, I absolutely believe that there's some huge challenges that can absolutely be devastating. I also believe that we have lots of reasons to see possibilities and potential in front of us that make for an even better world in the future for our kids and grandkids. Thank you much,
Andy, for joining us.
Yes.
Great pleasure to talk to you. And for the participants, thank you very much for listening in. Hopefully you got some good takeaways from here. So have a splendid Friday and a good weekend.